Welcome to the apocalypse, everybody. This is another episode of the BREWtally Speaking Podcast, coming to you from two separate houses because we're not allowed to be anywhere near each other in this day and age. With me, as always, digitally, is Daniel Terry. How are you doing this evening?
Well, I'm alive. I think I'm okay. I'm not showing any symptoms, but apparently that's going to take 2 weeks. So, we'll.
I don't know. You look a little pixelated.
I mean, pixelation is a very, very strong indicator of coronavirus, and
okay.
I'm not trying to make light of that situation at all. It's actually really terrible, and I can't believe people are not taking it seriously.
Probably by the time this comes out, we'll probably have done about a 3 or 4 part series about that. Full transparency, with this basically shutting down the music industry as a whole. I've been talking to a lot of my friends. We have a couple of interviews coming up with Justin Foley of Killswitch Engage and JB of August Burns Red. I was one of the only 2 dates that Killswitch August Burns Red tour got to play. And as a result of JB and I talking initially about the coronavirus and not really knowing the severity of what it would do and the impact it'd have on the music industry, we're going to be doing another chat here pretty soon in the next couple of days as of when we're recording this, which is St. Patty's Day, which, man, I can't think of another industry that just took a big hit other than the bar and service industry on this night, at least. But, this episode's guest, having nothing to do with coronaviruses or anything that we've just recently been talking about, is Ben Jorgensen, singer and guitarist of Armor for Sleep. This was fun. Dan was actually on it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It's a very rare Dan and John interview, and those are always a lot of fun. At least they are to me. And I think that we got a lot of the inside information on Armor for Sleep, and now I'm bummed out because that tour is not coming anywhere near me. I think the closest it's coming is Chicago, and of course that's all tentative because of the apocalyptic virus that's taking over the world right now. So could not happen, could happen. I don't know. I'll try to make it for sure, especially after having that chat. This was a lot of fun for us, and again, having both of us there together was a huge plus. I think I'd love for us to be able to do more chats together. And
hey, you might get your wish with this coronavirus.
We got nothing but time, man. We got nothing but time. I mean, as of right now, I think John and I are still both going to work every day.
Yep.
I actually fix oxygen concentrators at my job, and so that's something that is in high demand right now because of the respiratory nature of the virus. So I'll probably be going to work every day for the time being. Yeah,
and unfortunately or fortunately, I guess I like making money. So, I work basically shipping stuff through FedEx and UPS. So until those are not functional avenues to ship out things, I still have to go to work as well.
You never know, man. I might send you that corn record back. I just might. Do you want to see it? I have it here.
Yeah. I trust that you're keeping it well.
It's a really high up on a shelf, so none of the kids can get it.
I don't think any of the kids should be anywhere near a corn record in the first place, especially that first one.
I mean, they're my kids, and discussing all Dan's kids. I mean, they've heard corn.
I guess they're probably listening to like Gore Guts and shit like that too.
Gore Guts, Cannibal Corpse, a little bit of Deicide here and there. It's all good for the education.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone's got to be homeschooled now anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, they're like, what does hypocrisy mean? What exactly, what role does Satan play in my daily life? These are all valid questions.
I wanted to do something a little bit different just because I don't know necessarily that everyone sticks around to the very end, because I see the YouTube comments and so forth where people were like, hey, fast forward to this point to listen to the conversation. So I want to give a plug to our sponsors right up here in the front. Rockabilia.com. They've come on recently, like I said, a couple episodes ago. Really stoked to have them on. Head on over to rockabilia.com. Check out their stuff. They're 100% real, officially licensed material, not that knockoff shit that you sometimes see on eBay and a bunch of other places, maybe from a local peddler outside of a rock venue during a show. Great stuff. Actually, in looking up right before we did this, they have Armor for Sleep merch. So, I mean, I don't know many places that would have Armor for Sleep as an available merch option, but they have hoodies, they have shirts, they have patches. You're going to find over 500,000 items on their website. If you're a first-time user, you get 10% off of your purchase. So head on over to rockabilia.com, get you some awesome swag, support them for supporting us. Podcorn, you know, we've been having them on the last couple episodes as well. It's a great avenue for basically podcasters or content creators to find advertisers for their shows. I mean, who doesn't want to try to make money doing this and help offset some of their costs? So thank you to Podcorn. Bean Bastard, I mean, if you're stuck at your house, you're probably going to go through a shitload of coffee. So go to thebeanbastard.com, get some coffee. And On Point Pomade, I mean, you still got to look presentable. So keep your beard and your hair looking good. Use the code BSP15. Get 15% off your total order. Let them know that we're sending you. Support all these sponsors for supporting us. And just want to get those out of the way in case you actually don't listen to them at the end of the thing. We're still going to do them back there too. But yeah, so as a whole, this conversation is actually pretty fucking long. It's about an hour and a half. So let's get right into our conversation with Ben from Armor for Sleep. And we'll talk to you on the other side of this. Well, we have the pleasure of spending our evening with Ben Jorgensen, however, depending on where you're from and which dialect you use, singer and guitar player for Armor for Sleep. Welcome back, I guess. You've been gone for a little while, and other than the Lead Singer Syndrome podcast, guys made a bit of a splash announcing this 15th anniversary tour of What to Do When You're Dead, and I think surprised a lot of people because I don't know if you're answering what you do when you're dead is basically you come back and show everyone like, hey, remember this awesome record we did and want to get down on some good rock and roll. So I guess I want to talk about this record because full transparency, Armor for Sleep wasn't really a band that I got into when you guys were first out. Dan and myself and a couple of different podcast episodes we'd done, we'd actually talked about how, there's that sweet spot when you're like 19 to like 24 and you're broke and you can't afford things. And this is a day and age where like smartphones weren't as prevalent as they are, computers weren't as cheap as they are, and internet cost a whole shitload of money. So there was a nice like 4-year gap where like I couldn't afford to go to shows or buy CDs and things like that. And there's a whole scene basically that kind of went by me. And I feel like you guys were kind of sadly one of those bands, not for lack of hearing your name, just lack of the funds to be able to support you in any way, shape, or form. And it wasn't until I started dating my wife that she actually got me into this record. And it's really weird to find a record almost 10 years after it had been out and being like, oh my God, where was this the whole time?
That's cool, man. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, something that, in doing a lot of my due diligence about this record, something that I always kind of thought was interesting, Machine is one of my favorite producers of this kind of era. And something that, in the last couple of years that I've heard many stories of Machine, from watching DVDs or talking to some bands that have worked with him, he's kind of a very hands-on producer. Now, I've heard that working to some bands, bringing the best out of them. Like I'm thinking of Dan and I were actually talking earlier about, when he did the Sacrament record with Lamb of God, and all those guys talked about how, he was pushing everybody to kind of create the best that they could. Yes. But then, I've heard stories of a band like Every Time I Die who did Gutter Phenomenon with him, and they were like, we just, didn't feel like it was the right person, felt like he was kind of trying to push things on us that weren't really what we wanted. And for this being such a very interesting record in concept, sounds, and all that kind of stuff, kind of wanted to know how, starting with the producer, who is a big part of how a record can be, what did you find working with Machine was like, and what did he add to this this record that maybe no one really would think that he's added to the record that they love?
Yeah. Well, Machine was an integral part of this record for sure. And he added a lot to it. I can go into specifics about it. I think at that point it was a great partnership because we had this concept for an album, and I had this idea to kind of make it like a story that I'd been talking about, that I'd been talking to a couple producers about, actually. And we met Machine, and I told him about this, and he immediately was like super into the idea and just wanted to help us facilitate that idea, as opposed to like somebody taking it and be like, oh, I want to kind of make it my own thing. He was just on board for the vision of it, and he really had the tools to, help us execute it. Just technically, as a producer coming from the world that he came from, he definitely, I feel like, even though he did, Lamb of God was not our scene at all, but even outside of Lamb of God, I feel like Lamb of God was in a way one of the most, I guess he had worked with like hard rock bands, but not like as cool as Lamb of God. But it wasn't like he was in the scene working with like a lot of bands that came from either the metal or like hardcore world. And so like, I was like, is he even going to like get us? But like the different influences that he had working with like weird, like British, like trip hop things. Like he was really into like DJ Shadow and just this weird stuff. Like he was able to add all these weird flavors that I don't think any of the producers that we knew like from the scene would have been able to add in. So I think it was really interesting. And I think that for that specific like vision, we were like a really good team for.
Well, and I think that's perfect too, because if you think about it, if you have a producer that is firmly rooted in hard rock or whatever, they're going to try to make your record into just a standard rock record, which obviously isn't what you guys were going for at all.
Yeah.
You were going for something that was a little bit more, I don't know, this might be a pretentious word, but like more ethereal sounding, like a little bit more, bit more dreamy, a little bit more hazy. So you'd say that he was able to assist in that maybe in a way that other producers wouldn't have been able to?
Yeah, like if I tried to talk to him about like, I don't know, a Lifetime song, he'd be like, who is Lifetime? But then if we were like, oh, this is going to sound like Pink Floyd, he'd be like, I know Pink Floyd. So we had all these, we had these different things, like it's basically like a Venn diagram, like our circles didn't meet in a lot of areas where like, I think in terms of like, we all came from like the hardcore punk scene and then eventually to like post-hardcore and like bands like At the Drive-In. It did like more melodic, weird stuff. Like he didn't come from that world, but like where we did meet in the middle of the Venn diagram, I think were a lot of the sounds that wound up making it onto this record, So that was cool and interesting. And I think different than if we had just gone with whatever dude was making all the Fearless Records albums,
Right.
Well, something actually kind of speaking to that's interesting is, kind of thinking back to when you were making this record. I mean, you kind of, touched on like At the Drive-In, the shift in music was so weird at this point. I mean, you're having, it just makes me feel really fucking old sometimes when doing some of these conversations and remembering where I was and what was coming out and thinking about how interesting it was as far as, like you were saying, Lamb of God did a record with Machine, and it at the time sounded completely different than anything they had done. But then you look at some of the stuff like John Feldman was doing with bands like Atreyu, and, AFI went from being a punk band to now being this multi-genre-y kind of band, and everyone... the music scene as a whole was kind of all over the place, and it was kind of fun and exciting because you didn't know who was going to do what. Going into this record, following a rather successful, first record, major label record, was there pressure to sound like any of your contemporaries at that point going into this?
Going into What to Do When You Were Dead?
Yeah.
Well, so our situation was we had put out one album on Equal Vision before that, which was like... the people who were newly aware of our band liked, but it was also weird for us because we came up when we started playing our first shows. We played with a small band from Long Island called Taking Back Sunday. Like we became friends with them right when they signed to Victory. And
who are they?
Yeah, exactly. And we were friends with a band from Chicago called Fall Out Boy, who when we started playing shows with them were very small. And so when we came out with our first album, they were like, oh man, you guys are going to be huge. And we didn't, you know what I mean? Like we developed some fans, but like we by no means got big off the bat. And on the same token, Taking Back Sunday and Fall Out Boy became massively big. So by the time we went to do What to Do When You Were Dead, I think we collectively had the feeling like no one really gives a fuck about us. And like we were watching our friends' bands get huge, but we almost like also we had just signed with new managers who were actually managing Fall Boy at the time. And I feel like they started managing us kind of out of like pity. Like they weren't even really paying attention to what we were doing. So I think that was almost a blessing in disguise for us, because we didn't have a huge fan base at that point. And like no one was really like, I don't like our management, the record label didn't even know that we were doing like a concept album. They were just like, yeah, we'll put out your second record. So in a way, and I actually learned this lesson, you know, it probably took me years to learn this lesson, but like that feeling of like not having anyone's eyes on us at the time is probably why we were able to do some of the cool stuff. And for me personally, as like a songwriter, it's probably why I didn't feel pressure, and where I was just able to do what I thought was cool, because there was zero, you know, thought in my head that this was going to be scrutinized by anyone. Yeah.
Right, because at that point, it's easy to just go the pop punk route, or to go, you know, like whatever Taking Back Sunday was doing that year. You know, like it's so easy to take that route. And if you had tons of eyes on you, you're not going to make the creative decisions that you made.
100%. And also as a 20-year-old kid, when you have those eyes on you and you look up to your managers, you look up to your record label, you're you know, mentally not able to, you know, stick to your guns as much, just being that age and being as vulnerable as all of us idiots are in bands, you know?
Sure.
Well, actually, something to that, you know, and something that we kind of harp on quite a bit on this podcast. Actually, I should come up with a different adjective, because harp sounds really bad. But basically, you know, in this time period of us, you know, all of us, or at least, you know, myself and Dan are in our mid-30s. So, I mean, thinking about when bands basically were getting signed, you just talked about going into this record, you're 20. And like I just was telling you, by the time you were putting out this record, I'm living on my own and can barely make ends meet, because that's the decision I made. But it's interesting to think about all these bands who got signed very young, either in high school or just coming out, and the thing that you were doing as a hobby, something for fun to do with your friends, now becomes looked at as a product. It has to sell copies, and it's making someone a living other than yourselves, or in addition to yourselves. Right. And thinking about how that affects your music. Because, you know, I'm sure the expectation, you know, the adage always is you have a lifetime to make the first record and a year to make the second one, if you're lucky. And so going into it at 20 years old, what was your mindset going into this? Because, I mean, I've read the interviews you've done in the past where you said, like, you know, you had 2 songs that you started writing with this idea in mind, this perspective on how you were going to write, and you started second guessing yourself. What's kind of walk me through that a little bit, because I think that's interesting that at 20 years old, you know, you're starting to come up with what will become a concept record, and that's not really something a whole lot of 20-year-olds really are brainstorming and trying to work their way through.
I don't know. Like, I mean, like I said before, I remember the first couple songs kind of were written from that perspective, but I didn't think I wanted to do the whole thing. And I just think it popped into literally like my life as writing songs is like what I think will be cool. And so that was just one of those moments of what I think would be cool, you know, and I wrote it down, and I just kept like putting the pieces together and thinking, you know, about like what that would take. And then the rest of the guys in the band were on board, and just like, you know, you asked like what I was going through at the time. You're right. It was really weird to be 20 years old. And, I started the band when I was 17, and I was a freshman in college when September 11th happened. Which kind of like shook me, and I'd been playing in bands already at that point, but I was like, you know, I guess I had a moment like a lot of people where I was like, I just, you know, like fuck school. I want to just do, you know, songs and see where the band will take me. But fast forward a couple years later, like the reality of that started to set in of like, what the fuck am I doing? And, you know, we had gone on our first few tours, and, you know, we put out our first album, which again, like being friends with bands like Taking Back Sunday, who were like, you guys are going to be the biggest band overnight. And then watching them explode and us still standing there, like holding their towels when they got off stage. It was just, you know, a strange feeling. So I think all of that compounded into this idea that I had to, you know, write songs from the perspective of someone who was dead, because I think I don't know, I can't say like I felt dead, but I definitely felt weird doing what I was doing. And just, in life, it's a weird path to pursue, but also specifically what was going on with our band at that time. And it was just a lot. And it's kind of crazy. Like I look at a 20-year-old kid now and they seem like a baby, you know what I mean? And it's
right.
But yeah, I mean, I'm stoked that we were able to do it, and I'm stoked that Machine, was on board and helped us and helped me do it. Yeah.
As far as musical influence goes, and I hate asking influence questions because it's like a really lame question to ask somebody. So,
sure.
But on this record, one thing that I think is really interesting is, you talked about, Taking Back Sunday and Fall Out Boy and stuff like that. But when I'm listening to Armor for Sleep, what I'm hearing more is hints of like old school, like some of the old hardcore bands that I grew up on, like Hope's Fall or Shai Hulud or bands like that.
Totally.
Was that definitely where you guys were coming from on that?
Yeah, I mean, so personally, like from just like the music that I always liked. So I grew up super into punk rock, and then I got into like hardcore, and I was one of those kids who like ordered everything from the Revelation Records catalog. So even like all the weird records like Shai Hulud and like By a Thread, anything that sounded like Sunny Day Real Estate, anything that sounded like, Converge too. I was super into that. And when I was in high school, there was like, I feel like there were two kinds of bands coming out. There were like the Newfound Glories of the world who were taking, I guess, the pop punk and like combining it almost with post-hardcore, but it was super poppy. And then there were bands that were more like Jimmy Eat World that were kind of coming from maybe like the Sunny Day Real Estate side of whatever the emo thing was. And it was still melodic, but it was a lot more like minor chordy and a lot more, dissident than just like the super happy all the time Newfound Glory sound.
Right.
And so my friends kind of split down the middle. Like I have a lot of friends who like just loved the Newfound Glory poppy stuff that was coming up, but I was just always drawn to, I guess, darker chord progressions. And I think one of my managers pointed out, like, you've never written a song in a major key. And I was like, that might be true, but that's just naturally what sounds better to me. Like, growing up, Nine Inch Nails was one of my favorite bands of all time. And thinking back now, it's probably because all of those songs are in a minor key. So yeah, those are just always the bands that resonated with me coming out of the scene. And yeah. And then obviously being from New Jersey, Lifetime and then Saves the Day were massively important because they took a lot of like the harder sound from like hardcore that all my friends were listening to at the time. But like, for instance, in Saves the Day, like Chris was singing about, breaking up with his girlfriend, but over like super fast, like hardcore songs. And I was like, wait, this is so much better than singing about, whatever, keeping the scene strong.
Well, and that was interesting too, in that, having a more dissonant approach, I always kind of took that as like, oh, well, because we're also writing songs from the perspective of, somebody that's dead, I always wondered if that was like an influence thing or if that was an intentional creative choice, and that like, if you're coming from the perspective of somebody that's dead, you can emulate beauty, but you have to do it through non-traditional means.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense, but I don't even think it was that conscious. That's just like, I guess that's how it comes out.
I read too much into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something when looking at this record lyrically and from the songwriting perspective, obviously it's a concept record.
Mm-hmm.
But something I always love figuring out or learning more about is how hard was it to figure out the track listing for this record? Were there different iterations where the songs weren't necessarily in the order that they are now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we played around with that a bunch. Like I think I have a little notebook where I played around with the different track order, but we also knew that the track order would be really important because we wanted to kind of have some songs that like bled into each other. And I also just wanted to know like lyrically, what the order was going to be, because I definitely wanted there to be some kind of story. And Machine was actually a big proponent of that too from the beginning. So when we did pre-production for this album, we recorded the entire album like in sequence from front to back as basically one long demo, so we could all kind of like resonate on it. And that's the exact order that it is now. So for this one, we went into the studio to track it like in order. Basically, we didn't actually track it like chronologically, but like we knew what the sequence was going to be. And that didn't change from, I think 3 months before we recorded it until it was done. So yeah.
Out of curiosity, and I don't think I've ever found it, but were there any extra songs that just didn't make this record? Because it seems like, it wraps itself up pretty well. It's self-contained very well.
Yeah.
But, you always hear people talking about like, we went in with, 22 songs, narrowed it down to the best 15. Were there extra songs that were written for this record that just never made it past the demo stage?
So yes and no. So so basically no, I guess. So, there is one hidden track on the actual CD that comes before the first track that plays. You have to like do that thing where you skip before. Yeah. It's like, I don't even know how it got that name because there's actually never been a name given to it. But like when I look online, so someone thought of that name and I guess it's there. And then, the B-side is a song called Very Invisible that I guess originally we were playing around with maybe sneaking into the track listing, but I think early on we realized it was kind of redundant because it was going to fit towards the end of the record. So we wound up just releasing it as a B-side. But aside from that, there were honestly no other songs written for this record, which is very weird because for the next album we did, which was our last album, I think it had like 12 or 13 tracks on it. And we probably wrote like 60 songs for that one. So, sometimes more is not better.
Right. Well, it sounds like you had a much more complete thought, with this one, and that's got to be scary too, though, because was there ever any fear that like the label is going to come back and be like, this one needs to go, or was it even like that at all?
So thankfully, Equal Vision, who was our label for the first two records and What to Do When You're Dead was the second one, they were super cool. And honestly, they were super supportive of us. And they believed in us and in our vision and the artwork. We hired who we wanted to do the art. Like I found a really cool company that I liked who did stuff. And I was like, this is how the art needs to be. And Equal Vision was like, cool. Yep. What's the name? Awesome. Cool. Concept album. Great. And like, they were 100% supportive. And I think that was great because we didn't have to deal with that. And that would have sucked, if they'd come back and been like, cool, these 11 songs are cool, but can you write 3 more? Like that would have sucked. And I think then we would have started second guessing ourselves. So I'm very thankful to those guys for having given us the leeway to do what we did, because I think sometimes labels fuck it up and managers fuck it up when they want to be too involved. And, the bigger something gets too, the more people feel like they want to justify whatever, their paycheck or what they do. So the more they feel like they have to chime in, even if the opinion isn't necessarily going to help with the thing,
Sure. I don't know how big of a Hopes Fall fan you are, but considering kind of, I don't want to say that the band sounds similar, but seem to come from the same place,
for sure,
musically.
Oh yeah, no, Hopes Fall were awesome. I think the only shows we played with them were when we were both kind of on some weird stage on Warped Tour, if I'm not mistaken, in like 2005 maybe. Yeah, those dudes, I always was just like, this is a very cool band, and I had nothing but respect for them. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, with pushing this record, obviously Car Underwater was, I don't know if quote unquote promotional singles were a thing at this point, like they are now, where you get, the first song well before the record comes out, and then the official first single is whatever it happens to be, which in this case would have been Truth About Heaven, if we're using that example. How hard was it to pick a single off of a record that isn't necessarily a singles-based kind of a record?
Yeah, I guess it was pretty tough, but I think the label really liked Car Underwater from the beginning. So I think that was an easy one to pick out. I think The Truth About Heaven was a little bit harder, but yeah, honestly, I think, those, I don't think those songs were ever on the radio, but I remember MTV2 was a thing, and Equal Vision definitely pushed us to MTV2, which was interesting for them because I feel like they got a little bit of MTV play with Saves the Day, but like this was the first time that they were actually like pushing one of their bands at MTV, and it actually got a bunch of plays. But I remember even then thinking like, do people who listen to this know that this is part of like, a full story in an album?
Right.
And I guess I never like, I could never do a survey with the people who watch the video on MTV. Like, what do you think? Is this song part of a large story? I guess it was just always a question mark in my head. Like, how is it received, or does it stand alone as its own thing? So I don't know.
Well, kind of adversely with the tours you were doing, because I was trying to look up the tours to see if you were doing more support tours or doing more headliners, or if it was about even. But just for the sake of argument of the question I have, which is, if you're doing support tours and you're trying to promote this record, how did you pick which songs to play off of this? Because again, you're kind of pushing a record which has got a narrative behind it. So do you try to play more of this and give more of the story, or just kind of pick songs that sound cool and would go over better in a live setting?
Yeah, we just tried to play songs to have the people jump around the most, because we were always supporting other bands.
Right.
And we were just, I think we learned early on that we had to fight at every show to get fans, because we were just a different kind of band, I think. And because I played guitar and sang and wasn't, like Gerard from My Chem, who's this like, super charismatic frontman, like I was stuck behind my guitar. Like, we really had to learn to work it if we had any hopes of having anybody, of winning anyone over. So the song selection for us, if we tried to do what you're saying and like explain, like we're going to play a selection of a story, like there would just be crickets. So we just had to be like, what is going to start a mosh pit when we open for All American Rejects? Or like, that's literally what we had to do. And so, yeah, that's how we chose it. So live, it was basically like survival, and hope they like it and hope they get the album and are like, wait a minute, what is this? Yeah.
I think it's just interesting to kind of think back to this, because I mean, like we were saying a little bit ago, My Chem was getting ready to put out Black Parade, and we had records at this point that were coming out that were concept records that weren't alienating people. Like, people were getting, all of the Coheed records and so forth. And I mean, it's like, even to a lesser degree, New Jersey based band as well, but like War All the Time with Thursday, like, there were these, whether they're loose or very tightly constructed concepts,
totally,
bands doing it, and bands were kind of like, I saw My Chem on that Black Parade tour, and they 100% went out dressed in the garb, kind of, that was the narrative.
Absolutely.
They just kind of focused on that record, telling that story, and finding ways to put in a song like The Ghost of You, and finding songs from their past that kind of worked within that narrative as well. So I kind of didn't know if you guys were trying to do something similar. Now, adversely though, with you playing guitar and singing, was there ever a thought to kind of maybe do something like you were seeing, Green Day and some of these other bands doing, where you have an ancillary guitar player? Probably couldn't afford to do such, honestly, now that I say that, but of coming out and being more of a traditional frontman.
Yeah. So a couple points on that. One, there's a reason, and a well-deserved one, why My Chem basically became the biggest band in the world, or you know what I mean, or like close to it. And that's because they fucking like lived it, and everything about them, it worked so perfectly with the whole obviously like the makeup and like the costumes, and it was just really, really super well done, and those guys are amazingly talented, and obviously Gerard's a great singer. Everything is very well executed. I just think we're a different kind of band. I remember when we were in the studio, like a bunch of producers would be like, man, if you would just wear a little makeup or like do this, and I don't know, maybe it's because we came from like the hardcore, like kind of like DIY world. Not saying My Chem didn't. Again, like I think what they did was genius, but I think maybe like for us, we always felt like that level of like showmanship. Like, I feel like Thursday, who are like basically brothers with My Chem, they both came up together. I feel like Thursday kind of feel like that too. Like, Jeff, the singer from Thursday, could never do what Gerard does because they're just a different kind of band. And I feel like we just always felt like we were not that kind of like showy band that would wear the coordinating outfits and do the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, maybe things would have been different if we would have done that. But at the same time, I don't think there's a world that we would have done that, because that's just not who we were,
I was going to say, you could have dressed up like ghosts, Yeah.
Exactly.
But again, that's like, we talked about influences a little bit. That's not what Shai Hulud does. That's not what Thursday does. That's not,
Right.
It doesn't really work. And I think I think that to a certain extent too, that the music really should be able to speak for itself in a situation like that. And I'm not bashing bands like My Chemical Romance by any means, but like I feel like with what to do with what to do when you're dead is just very I don't know, like beyond just saying that like it speaks for itself musically and lyrically. And speaking of lyrics too, this is something that I run into on these podcasts, is that I feel like there's not a lot of the population that really pays attention to lyrics and concepts. And so like, were you worried at all that like maybe when what you were throwing down was going to go over people's heads, to an
Sure.
extent, like people are just like, I just want to listen to music that I can mosh to, or music that just
Totally.
makes me feel good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that I wrote these songs on a hunch, and I think most of the songs I wrote on a hunch that it's almost like, I don't know, throwing like a handful of coins at a refrigerator and some of them are magnets.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
The one that are magnets are going to stick and that connection is going to be hard, but you also acknowledge that most of them are not magnetized and will just spray off. So
Right.
like, I feel like I had a hunch writing, when I write normal songs, and I had a hunch writing these songs that like, yes, it is tough to get into. And also, we're not the kind of band that's necessarily as immediate as My Chem, but I also had the hunch that the people who did get it, like, were going to really connect to it,
Sure.
And again, that's not to say what My Chem has is bad, because I think My Chem basically has like a handful of magnetized coins. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
they have the stuff to hook people from the beginning and the hooks, but then they also have the depth, and you know what I mean? But yeah, so that was my hunch, and I think I was aware of that from the beginning. And so it's okay that, whatever, if it's not someone's cup of tea or if someone doesn't quote unquote get it, like that doesn't mean, I'm wrong or they're wrong. It just means that, people connect with different things. And also sometimes people connect with things based on where they are in their lives too.
Sure.
I think I'm a lot more understanding of that now than maybe I was when I was younger. There's no correct art. It's like sometimes it connects with people, sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't make it less true or more true.
Sure.
So something that was really interesting to me when you did the Lead Singer Syndrome podcast was talking about what would become Smile for them. And the band kind of, going, like I said, coming into it after the fact of the band being gone and going back and, listening to everything after it had already been released and so forth, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Refused a little bit, where, I got into Shape of Punk to Come and I was like, holy fuck, this band's great. Oh, fuck, they broke up. And then you go back and listen to like Fan the Flames of Discontent and so forth, and you kind of see the band and you see the evolution after the fact. And what was interesting to me when you were talking to Shane about this record is it reminds me a lot of one of my favorite bands and a situation that happened to them, which was Finch. So obviously everyone loved What It Is to Burn. However, my favorite record is Say Hello to Sunshine. And having had Nate on this podcast a while ago, he had made the comment about, because at the time when that record came out, press wasn't really what it is now. There weren't podcasts. It was kind of hard to find information about this record that seemingly didn't do well. The band either did or didn't like it. I don't know, because like I said, there wasn't much press behind it. And so what's interesting to kind of be able to do now is kind of retroactively talk about these things where there's not much known about it. And what was interesting to me is it seemed like you guys were poised for just monster success, almost in the way that Taking Back Sunday was from Louder Now when they did, their first major label record, which I think fittingly enough was actually on Warner Brothers as well. And what was really telling, and if I hadn't already talked to Nate and heard the same kind of a story, I probably wouldn't have believed it as much, because it's like, well, why the fuck would they do that? But basically you said, like, and you just said a little bit ago, you had 60 some odd songs, and if I remember in Shane's conversation with you, you were talking about how the label wanted a certain sound from you, and they kept saying, like, we don't hear the song, or we like this, go down more in that direction, and just kind of, I guess, fucked with you guys to where you didn't even know what you wanted anymore, it sounded like. What?
Yeah.
you basically said you had what would have been the original version of that record,
Totally.
but you didn't necessarily touch on that a whole lot. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about that. At this point, is that technically still Warner Brothers property? Like, do they own that, or because it's not what they released, can you ever put that out and put out technically the record that you wanted to initially?
That's a good question. I think they do not own the stuff anymore that we recorded around that time that was not actually released.
So Sunset Clause would be up at this point on them owning that, or
something. Yeah, I think when we left Warner Brothers, there was like some kind of agreement, like, hey, we're gonna go our separate ways. You own what you own, but you can't claim to own other stuff that we did around that time that you guys never officially released. Yeah, I think.
Just try it and find out.
Sure. I mean, not like, oh, if we put out that record, like, we'll be huge. Like, I don't think that at all. You know what I mean? I just think talking about that was very eye-opening, like how different the process was on a major label. And also, hearing you kind of recount what I said, it sounds so much more nefarious than it actually happened. Like, I don't want someone listening to this to think when you major label, you have these like board meetings with people in suits sitting around. It's all like young people that are cool, that work at these labels that you have connections with. I just think like the general public is just unaware of the fact that with developing bands, major labels really have no idea what the fuck they're doing. What they do really well is take something that's already big and just, they just want a cut of something that's already happening. But if it's not really happening yet, they don't know what to do. That's why they take so long to get these records done, because they literally don't really know what to do aside from just like when I talk about people just being concerned about their jobs. There's so many people that work at major labels that if people from this department aren't chiming in and this department aren't chiming in, it's just like any other company. Like, they don't want their bosses to think like they're not giving input. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's just a bunch of noise, So kids, I would encourage everyone, don't sign to a major label until you've sold, 3 million records. Then you can go ahead.
Well, and that, that kind of leads to my next question is, with the way that the music industry has changed since then, now really a major label doesn't make sense. I mean, I guess in a certain perspective it does. I guess if you're like a pop artist or, somebody that's, that they have a guaranteed hit with. But I feel like nowadays major labels aren't willing to take as much of a risk as maybe they were, when this style of music was starting to come to prominence, and I know, like, as a band, you guys haven't really, experienced that. I mean, you guys have come back for, select shows and stuff like that. But, like, how has your perspective changed on that nowadays where, if John decided tomorrow he was going to become a mumble rapper, he could go on and release an entire album from his MacBook and get the kind of support he needs. Do you feel like major labels or labels at all are even necessary at this point?
That's a really good question. I have so many friends 10 years ago that said major labels will be out of business in 2 years. And that's kind of what everybody thought. And it looked like it was going that way. And I think now with Spotify, they have found a way to keep making money off of their catalog, their back catalog. And I think ultimately that, and the fact that people still listen to terrestrial radio and that they can still pay to have their artists on the radio, I think will ultimately like keep them in power. But I think my perspective has changed since we were on a major label, and kind of like this goes to what we were talking about before about people discovering music and forming connections with it. Like you said that you found out about What to Do When You Were Dead when your wife played it for you. And, I think as an artist, when I was in a band, I would get so discouraged when I wouldn't see the immediate feedback when we'd be like, oh, we came out with What to Do When You Were Dead a month ago. Why isn't the show sold out?
Right.
Because like I had a suspicion this would connect to people. But you know what? Music and songs, sometimes it takes years and years and years for it to really develop like a deep connection with a human being, because humans are so fucking complex. And also it takes, especially now with so much music on the internet, can you imagine how long it takes for someone to discover a song? But what? When someone discovers a song, that connection they could make with that song and that artist could last a lifetime. And I just think I have more of an understanding now that it takes time. And if you want to, start a band to make a quick buck, it's probably not going to happen. But at the same time, I think that people still connect with music just as much now as they did then. And that has nothing to do with major labels. It has nothing to do with anything. But yeah, I think unfortunately major labels are still the gatekeeper in a lot of different corners of this business.
Sure. I mean, even a lot of the upstarts that I'm talking about, they might have upstarted, they might have put their first record out on their computer, but they eventually ended up signing with a major, at some point.
And also to clarify, when I was not saying major labels are bad, the thing that was interesting to me when, talking and listening to your conversation with Shane and you going through that whole album cycle, basically in the recording process, when talking with Nate from Finch, he basically told me the label, when they heard it, they went through 3 different producers, and when they went to turn it in, they were like, yeah, we're shelving this. And thankfully they didn't. But I mean, it's like that's the unfortunate side of this thing, and sometimes why I get a little bit wrapped up in talking about and I know this isn't a word, but I make it one, the commoditization. Yeah, it's not a word. But basically of your music, and they're looking at it going, will this outsell the last thing you did? Will this make us the recording budgets were way bigger back then than they are now, but they look at the dollars and cents and look at it not from an artistic standpoint. And it's interesting to see how some of these things years later, when Say Hello to Sunshine came out, people were like pissed because it wasn't What It Is to Burn Point 2. Same with like when Refuse put out Elektra, it wasn't Shape of Punk to Come 15 years later, so they were pissed. And to me, what was interesting is, you're following up a record that, you got a lot of eyes on you, and by all accounts, it seemed like you guys, by the time it came out, weren't really stoked on it because you guys seemed like it had kind of been beaten out of you a little bit, and it was just kind of a drag to get to the finish line of getting something out that everyone could agree upon. Mm-hmm. And then fans didn't seemingly like it at the time. Mm-hmm. But I do wonder now, because, a lot of fans, like you were just saying, it takes some time for music to catch on. Are you finding that people are now coming to you 13 years later going, you know what, man, Smile for Them actually is a really fucking good record, and I just didn't give it a fair shake when it first came out, but man, I love the whole record. I really love these songs. Is it interesting? Does it have that second life that it just, you never expected it to have in when you put it out?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we've heard over the years that people are like, man, that like, actually what's funny is after I did that the podcast with Shane, I got a ton of messages like, shit, like I feel like you guys were just like trashing that record, but I actually really liked it. And yeah, for sure. I think, I think maybe it wasn't given a fair shake when it came out, but yeah, I mean, I don't blame anyone else for that. And yeah, I mean, I will be honest, it doesn't have the same afterlife as What to Do When You're Dead With. Like, that album, I think, definitely has connected with people more over the years that we hear about than Smile for Them. But I don't laugh at someone if they said that they like Smile for Them. I'm like, cool, you definitely like went out and listened to it then, because that, the reception of that record was not good when it came out.
Do you think too that it had something to do with the fact that like people were, I don't know, like, did you feel like it had something to do with the fact that like labels were pushing, at that time to take these bands that were doing something new, something exciting, and trying to get them to more or less conform with what they felt like worked?
I think what was going on was the same thing that happened post Nirvana in the grunge world, where people in major labels were like, grunge? What's grunge? Oh, this is a band from Seattle that wears flannel shirts. Let's have them put out a record and maybe it'll make money, because they were looking for the next Nirvana. And the same thing was happening with us when we were a band. Like, I remember when we went to record some demos at the studio we always went to in New York, and Mike Hem were there the day before. This is before they even signed to Warner Brothers. And I remember there being like 3 cars parked outside of the studio of like older dudes who were from labels. Like, labels were sniffing out the scene hard. And that record, Smile for Them, was in the phase when all these major labels started scooping up basically like every band from that scene. Now looking back on it, I realized what they were doing was they were just hoping that one out of every, 50 that they would sign would be like My Chemical Romance. They weren't really paying attention to like, how does this band fit in the scene? What works about the band? What doesn't? Because to them, it's all, they're like, if one of the 50 bands winds up being as big as My Chem, we will have made back all the money that we paid the 49 other artists. Like we'll have made back the money that we paid them their advance for.
Right. Yeah.
And I think at the time this whole scene was flooded with a lot of bands, that were influenced by the same bands that we were. And it was just a lot of the same stuff. And then I think kids were becoming aware that all these bands, their new records sounded like very much more produced than the last couple. And now they're like, it's just nothing was as cool as it was when we were all on these cool like indie labels that was from the scene. And kids sniff that out and they can tell when a band, has major label backing instead of like indie label backing. And I think it was happening to a lot of bands. And I think people who grew up in that scene were just kind of, getting bummed out by it and we're looking for something a little bit fresher.
Definitely.
So let's move to the present at this point. You guys, did a reunion show, what was it, 2015? 2012?
Yeah, 2015. We did a couple shows.
What was the catalyst? I mean, obviously it's a 15-year anniversary tour. I mean, I get that, but what really was the catalyst for getting the band back together to celebrate this record now? Because I mean, you typically you see these. It's the 10-year, the 20-year, the 25th. 15. You're kind of branching out into some uncharted territory there with a 15-year anniversary.
Yeah, it's funny. I think so. Dan Sancho, who's the head dude at Equal Vision, it was the same guy who was at Equal Vision when we were recording What to Do When You're Dead. The same guy that's just always been like a fan of us. And they did a Saves the Day 20-year reprint of Through Being Cool. And Saves the Day played some shows and they played in LA, and Chris texted me, the singer, and was like, "Hey, do you want to come out?" And I was like, "Yes." So I came out to the show and Dan was there. And so I caught up with him and he was like, what do you think about playing some shows? And I was like, man, it's been forever. I really don't know. I was like, I would do it if, like people would come to the shows, but I think it's been so long at this point. And like, I feel like unless I knew that people would be stoked, I would feel so presumptuous just to be like, I'm sure people still care. Like, that's not in my personality. But Dan was like, I really think people would be into it. And so he was like, we could do like a reissue of the record. And on that record, we could maybe do some like unreleased songs, or if there's something that you wanted to put out, we could figure out how to make that happen. So I called our booking agent and was like, hey, do you think like if we played shows, would anyone come? And so he's like, I don't know, let me talk to a couple promoters. And then like a month later, he came back with promoters offers from around the country. And like, it was pretty fucking cool to see, because the promoters know in their markets, like they kind of have their finger on the pulse of like what shows their constituents would come out to. So it was cool. That was the moment when I was like, oh, fuck. So I guess this could be something that we could do. And, if our fans, after all this time, if the record still means something to them, then like we'd be happy to celebrate it. I guess I'm probably I'm not like I'm hard on myself, but I'm just not the type of person to assume, that like people would still be, listening after all these years and want to come out to the shows. So I guess it took a little bit of convincing. But yeah, I mean, to go back and play the record after all this time is cool. And I think, things just ended kind of weird for us, especially, our whole experience with Warner Brothers afterwards. And it just feels like we never really had a time to like celebrate that record because things kind of accelerated so fast afterwards and everything was just shit on and the whole scene was shit on. And we kind of broke up in a haste and like, we've never really had a time to be like, all right, let's just fucking like do something normal and nice for our fans and just celebrate it,
Yeah.
Well, and I would be remiss to ask, has there been any type of, and I know you guys haven't actually officially, embarked on any of these tour dates,
Yeah.
but I guess I'd be remiss to ask if there's ever been any kind of like spark to revitalize the project, to do something new, to do something different. And like, that's such a loaded question. I understand that. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm not trying to like get something out of you, you know what I mean? Like, or that, but like, has there ever been a thought to like, we could probably in the modern music business, like put something out and it might actually be big for the fans?
That's a very interesting question. I think if you had asked me that 6 months ago,
Yeah.
I probably would have said like a hard no.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting. It's interesting to think about. And I definitely think I was a little bit, again, unaware of, I guess, the people that would, I don't know how to put it, that would be like stoked on us. And it is kind of interesting to think about, like, don't want to go into the whole thing again, just for the sake of not repeating. But like, the whole songwriting process for Smile for Them, which is the last thing we really did, was like not really fulfilling and not really, I think what we started off doing. So it is kind of intriguing to think of, something else, but, I don't, no plans for that, but I just think it's maybe not the same hard no that it would have been.
Right, yeah. So it's not an official announcement, but it's like yeah,
Yeah.
I get you. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think Armor for Sleep would sound like now, all these years after the fact?
Man, I got to tell you, the stuff that we did back then, like we weren't trying to sound like something, so it would pretty much sound like that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think we'd come back and be like rap metal now that our influences have changed. And like I said before, like the way I just typically write songs, like people have come up to me like, oh, like, so do you always like just try and have all your songs sound like Armor for Sleep? And it's like, no, that's literally just how it comes out. Like that's, so
that's
as
me.
much as I would try for it to be something else, that it's just literally going to sound like that. Which again, talking about the whole, like, I think, I have an understanding now that like, I am okay with that, and I'm not like a 23-year-old asshole that's like, how do we take what we're doing and expand the fan base? Like I am under I would be under no illusions of that. And in trying to like, reach beyond our world, I think, if we did anything, it would just be more of an understanding of kind of like what we're good at,
15 years later, after What to Do When You Were Dead has been out, what does the album mean to you now versus what it maybe meant when you were writing it and it first came out?
Yeah. So, I'm not gonna derive like meaning from the lyrics of it, because obviously like, that was me writing it. I think it's more meaningful to me because, like I never really like kept a journal, but I imagine if someone kept a diary and opened it up to like, 15 years ago, it's kind of a trip. And the fact that I have that record, like, it's like a living journal to me. Because when I listen to it, I go right back to like being in Machine Studio. Like I remember I turned 21 because we recorded it in the summer. My birthday's in July when we were recording that album. And, just thinking back to like what my life was like at that time and what we were all going through, it's just like, I'll never forget that period of my life now, because it's kind of like etched into, I guess my computer now for whenever I want to listen to it. So that's how it's most meaningful to me, because, no matter how old I get, that I'm still the same age when I listen to that damn record.
Right. So something I actually forgot to ask you in the moment of talking about the lyrics for the record, and I kind of wanted to get to it before I completely forgot it again, and then goes, holy shit, I forgot to ask that.
Sure.
You had talked about writing the first couple of songs for the record, and as a story has been said, that basically you tried to find other perspectives to write about, and then saw a book, and then basically that kind of, you took that as a sign. I don't think I've really ever heard you talk about if you are, I don't want to say spiritual, but if you believe in things of that sort, where things will kind of, like life will kind of give you the signs and point you in a direction where you are supposed to be. Because I thought that was really interesting, especially given the theme of kind of everything of that record.
Yeah, totally. That's a good question. So kind of to answer your question, like, no. I'm like super kind of like science oriented. Like my dad, he went to college for theoretical physics. So like, he just always raised me, like talking about like gravity and space time. And so we like religion and like spiritual things, in terms of like heaven and like, you're going to heaven or hell. Like I never believed in, spiritual things like that. And I in terms of superstitious things, I'm always the first person to say like, there's gotta be a practical reason for that. But that's just in my, I think that's just personally how I think about the world, but that's not necessarily the most interesting way to think about things. And, I think what's more interesting to me is why people are drawn to have the beliefs that they do have. And I think there's something, it's so telling about, human beings and the human experience, like all of the superstitious things that we each have in our lives. And, the religious beliefs. I'm so intrigued by that because it says so much about us as a species and what puts our minds at ease. So yeah, I don't think I believe in I guess there's a really people say this a million times. So I don't believe in religion that I'm sure is like the widely accepted forms of religion, in terms of like spiritualism. Aside from that, I mean, my answer is probably like either a no or like a no with like a tiny question mark somewhere down the page. You know what I mean? That's a very small question mark.
Well, you just lost half your fan base. No, I'm kidding.
I'm sorry, guys.
No, it's fine.
You weren't on Solid State, so you're good.
You're not on Solid State Records. You're okay. You weren't on Tooth and Nail. It's okay. But one thing that like getting together and playing this record, beginning to end, like how is that going to feel for you as far as presentation goes, to be revisiting kind of these ideas and concepts? I mean, you've lived an entire life since then.
No, it's great. I mean, I literally, like, it makes me really excited to think about. And again, the first thing, I just wanted to make sure that people actually would be excited about it, and then once that was solved, and so we put up tickets for these shows, and I think the show in New York sold out in like 5 minutes, and LA sold out in, like a half an hour or something. And when we were an actual band, we, I don't think we ever, played at places that were that big. So like, I don't care about that in terms of the numbers, but what feels really good is just knowing that we'll be up there playing these songs that actually mean something enough to people to have like paid tickets for and want to be like singing back to me. I mean, that means the absolute world to me, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be than that, because I think, that was kind of like my hunch all along. And I can't think of, something more gratifying than doing something, than creating some kind of weird song that, not everyone's going to like, but you just hope upon hopes that it could mean something to someone. And then, 15 years later, to be able to play for like 1,000 people in Philadelphia that are going to, be there, wanting to sing along to a record that came out 15 years ago. Like, that to me is, mind blowing and the coolest thing ever. So I have literally nothing. I can't even think of any kind of negative thing about that. Maybe if I was a 22-year-old, I'd be like, oh, but I won't be up there playing like a new song that I wrote. But like, I think just having a realistic understanding of how cool that is, I think is not lost on me or any of us. And it's going to be awesome.
Makes me feel old. 15 years later, man, like when I heard this record, it was like 4 kids ago. Man, that's insane.
That's awesome.
What are you looking forward to being able to do as far as the presentation in a live setting for this record? Are you looking forward to doing?
That's a good question. I mean, one thing, we're playing some shows, like we're playing in Philadelphia and New Jersey and New York. And I know there are people going to multiple shows, so I don't want to do the same thing for people that could be coming to multiple shows. However, we're presuming we're going to play all of What to Do When You Were Dead. Also,
Psych, we're actually playing Smile for You in its entirety.
Oh my God, right? That would hit. Yeah, right.
Sorry.
Surprise. Yeah.
Yeah, God. But like, I think it might piss people off if we don't do it in order, but I don't think we like have to necessarily do it in order every night. So we just might switch up what we do, and we're not gonna have like projectors and fog machines on stage though, you know.
I forget who it was. We talked to someone about doing a tour like this, and they're like, "Yeah, I really hope, you know, because it was dude from Eve 6, John, the guitar player from Eve 6. And, you know, their big hit is like the first or second song. And he goes, I hope people don't leave.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the first song on the record is Car Underwater. And like in a live setting, I know that always does the best. So it would be kind of lame. I mean, that's why every band saves their best song for last, because they want everyone to be there. And, you know, you kind of like want to build up the anticipation. So I've definitely thought about that. But I also think that people sometimes really want to hear the whole record in order. And also, I think sometimes people are like, oh, we just want to hear the record in order. But if like for us, the Car Underwater was a bigger song. It's the first song. Sometimes people say that, but then as a performer on stage, you're like, well, everybody said that's what they wanted. But actually, the show may have been better if we didn't give it to them. So,
yeah.
So it's like sometimes like you feel like you know better than them. But I've warmed up to kind of like doing the album in order more as like what is to be like expected. And I'm down with that too. I just, you know, I want to do something that's interesting. Hopefully it does.
Well, I would typically have you plug the dates, but unfortunately with the situation we're in when we're recording this, I've been seeing shows postponed further than your tour dates. So
totally.
Let's go ahead and tentatively go ahead and have you record where you can buy the tickets for the show and and act like everything's gonna, you know, be cleaned up in time for this to come out.
Sure.
But full transparency, we all don't know what's gonna happen from here going forward. So if these shows get postponed, we'll obviously, when we do the intros and so forth, we will let you know. We'll probably cut this part out.
Sure. Well, you can probably leave this part, because I think by the time this goes on, there will have been made an announcement anyway. So when I record it, I'll just say, as of today on March 17th, you know, here are when the shows are, but, you know, check out our website or whatever.
Well, on a more positive note, where can people find you and the band online? And
sure.
I mean, we don't know what you have going on for the rest of this year,
right?
Yeah. So I mean, as of right now, which is March 17th. 2020, we have our 15-year anniversary shows for What to Do When You're Dead, which start in mid-June, and they're all spaced out through September. And you can go to armorforsleep.com for all the tickets, and we're on Instagram at Armor for Sleep. And I am on Instagram at Benjorg, Benjorg. And by the time this podcast airs, we'll see where the world is. But there is definitely a possibility, based on, you know, what the CDC is going to recommend for gatherings, that a lot of the shows that are currently scheduled for the summer are going to have to move to later. So, you know, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate for us. It's unfortunate for everyone, but life is kind of unfortunate for everyone right now. And so we just, you know, we have to follow whatever guidelines are given, and our booking agent is trying to stay ahead of it and trying to, you know, be as fair as possible to our fans in terms of like not jerking them around and having one show be rescheduled and having to reschedule it again. So we just got to figure out, I mean, this thing is moving so freaking fast that just everyone is like, you know, has no idea what to do. So it is unfortunate timing, but that's the world, and we're all figuring it out together, you know.
I know I'm looking forward to trying to go to the Chicago date, since that's on a Friday, with my wife, and going to see this. So hopefully it doesn't sell out before we can buy tickets.
Yeah, for sure. And if it's not when it's supposed to be, it'll be, you know, not that much later. You know, we just obviously we just want to make sure people are going to be able to go, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And
awesome, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Definitely.
So that was our conversation with Ben Jorgensen, again, guitarist, singer of Armor for Sleep. Had a lot of fun with that one. You may not expect either of us to be Armor for Sleep fans, and, as we kind of said right out the gate, which I kind of feel like a dickhead for saying this, but I don't really ever see the point of sucking someone's dick for no reason and being like, oh man, I loved your band for ever since the first EP ever came out. No, I think there's something, and it was kind of the fun thing in talking with him about talking about how some of the fans of his band had come out after the fact of them being broken up, or only found them on that one record after it had been out. And I'm one of those, and I constantly thank my wife for, playing that record, and me just as a guitar player and someone who loves good production and just good songwriting, it's a really solid record. It sounds great. It still holds up. There are definitely a lot of records I used to listen to from back then that I'm like, yeah, this didn't age very well. But I can definitely say that What to Do When You're Dead sounds great. It sounds like it came out relatively recently.
Well, yeah, and it's definitely in my wheelhouse. And anybody that knows my history with music, it's very much totally in line with the kind of bands that I liked and always talk about. So, I mean, in that regard, you'd be foolish not to check out, What to Do When You're Dead. And, I know it's 15 years old, but, we're old. It's fine.
Yeah, no, Armor for Sleep, though, they're kind of interesting, and and I kind of made a couple of allusions to it, basically way back to our conversation with Nate from Finch, and just kind of what Finch went through with, putting out a record that everyone loved, and then kind of having everyone be like, yo, what happened? I don't like this. And it's interesting when you're able to kind of go back 10, 15 years after a record came out that quote unquote disappointed you, and then through your more adult brain, or and I don't know how much of it really is the fact that you're just not around your peers at the time that would be like, this record sucks, and you're like, oh yeah, totally, I hate this, when really you do like it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that was me whenever I was younger, for sure. You only had time for so many bands back then because you only had so much money, which we talked about in the interview. But, it's definitely one of those situations where, I don't know, man. I definitely used to say some pretty horrible things about bands that were fantastic. Just look at my Pantera stuff. But, in a case like Armor for Sleep, I definitely felt bad. I definitely feel bad for some of the things I said about some bands back in the day. Just because I picked one band over the other.
Yeah, it's interesting though. We've talked quite a bit about this. We talked to Dennis and Refused a couple of weeks ago, basically about, just kind of being ahead of their fans, really. We talked about on that episode, I talked with Dennis, Fan the Flames came out and everyone loved that. But then Shape of Punk came out and people were like, this isn't Fan the Flames. Then Electric came out. Well, this isn't Shape of Punk to Come. Shape of Punk Comes the end all be all record. And then, now that Warm Music's out, people are like, well, I guess Electric's not that bad. And it's just like, man, what the fuck? People just can't ever seem to keep up with things. And, I know, again, going through all the discographies you do for discography discussion, I'm sure you come across this all the time. I think, one of the best examples of this was the Limp Bizkit stuff. When you guys did Limp Bizkit's discography, there was a lot of it that you're like, I never gave this a fair shake because I thought it just sucked. Because at the time, it wasn't this one record I really liked, and I moved on to other shit. But now in retrospect, listening to these things as a whole, I actually think these are pretty solid records. And it's one of those things where I think that happens more than we want to admit, because there's nostalgia attached to these things. And I don't know, I think a phrase you kind of constantly say as of late, and I'll just update it for this year, is I'm looking at this with my 2020 brain, not my, 2005 brain.
Yeah, totally. And Limp Bizkit's a great example because, I went into that episode expecting to hate it. I was ready, dude. I had my notepad out. I was like, dude, I'm going to tear every single one of these records a new one. And as I went through it, I was just like, this slaps. This slaps. This is cool. This is cool. This is different. This is not what I was expecting at all from this band. And a lot of the assumptions I had about the band back at that time were mainly shaped by society and not by the records themselves. And I think, with this Armor for Sleep record, I think that really hits home. in the sense that, like, I was into Hopesfall and Shai Hulud and all that stuff that year. Why would I not have dug an Armor for Sleep record? There's no reason for it. It's right up my alley.
I think I was in a slightly different spot. I mean, being from the East Coast, like, there's a lot of the East Coast bands. You know, I actually had someone ask me this the other day. They're like, you know, you talk a lot on the podcast about being, like, into these bands. And, like, if you really do the math of your age, because, you know, they say, like, you know, you constantly say that you're, you know, in your mid-30s. Some of these records came out when you were, like, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, but, like, the thing that I think people sometimes forget, too, is people had siblings, and so you're kind of, and MTV was really popular. So I mean, like, my parents were ones that just left MTV on all fucking day. Like,
Right.
if we were home, typically MTV was the station that was on. So I'm getting anything from Yo MTV Raps to Headbangers Ball, which would be on later at the night, but I'm getting such a wide array of music broadcast to me every single day, in addition to whatever my friends, brothers and sisters and so forth are playing, plus whatever is the regional thing, which at that point, you know, being on the East Coast, like when Boyz II Men kind of broke, Philly was only a couple, like an hour or so away. So like when Boyz II Men started breaking, it's kind of happening there on the East Coast, like right where I'm at. So there's a lot of that it's like, when I say I liked some of these bands, and people are like, but you weren't that old to really be into it. I think people kind of don't understand what it was like to kind of get into music at a young age back then. I think we were kind of more fans of music as a whole at a younger age because it was so, we were so inundated with it between radio, MTV, and I just can't stress how big MTV was. I know it sounds weird in 2020 to be like, yo, MTV used to play music videos all fucking day of all different kinds. Like, they used to have dedicated shows to a specific genre of music. But it's one of those things, like, and you know, when Ben was actually talking about Truth About Heaven video being pushed on MTV2, I remember that as it was right toward the end of me moving out of my parents' house and living on my own. But I would go over to my parents' house to do laundry, and I would still watch MTVX when that was still a thing for a hot minute. Much Music was starting to play videos and starting to get a lot of bands coming through in studio. And it's, like I said, it's just kind of interesting to think back at this time of sort of being broke, but starting to see the shift of things going to be more online versus being on TV.
Well, I mean, back then, like, at least for me, it was more like how it made me feel. I wasn't going back and cross-referencing what year it came out, you know, because they would play a lot of stuff that might have been, you know, 10 years old or 5 years old at that point. And, you know, so yeah, I mean, a lot of the times I've gotten that too, where it's like your age doesn't match up with your fandom, but like, it's just like, I don't know, man, it came on MTV2 and it was late at night and I liked it.
Absolutely.
Like, that's the beginning and the end of the conversation, you know?
I'm interested to see what Armor for Sleep looks like for fans in 2020. I hate to keep bringing up the Nate from Finch angle, but I think it's one that really kind of works, where the band went away on the I can't say the strength of a record, but the lack of strength, the weakness of a record doing well on a major label, and fans just not being into it and then basically going away. I mean, that part of the story very much parallels Finch. And what's interesting to me is Finch came back, obviously did their anniversary tour of What It Is to Burn, put it out on vinyl, like all this kind of stuff, and had a bit of a resurgence, put out 2 records and an EP, and went away again. And it seems like fans still want Finch to exist. In what capacity, I don't know. Because it definitely seems like, for as many people say as they like Say Hello to Sunshine, I feel like when they play anything other than What It Is to Burn songs live, fans basically just go get beers or go to the bathroom or are on their phones. But
which is a travesty.
It absolutely is. So I'm hoping that if this tour does as well as it seems like it's going to do, dates are sold out as long as everything works out and it's allowed to keep happening, you know, amidst this coronavirus thing. I'm hoping that there is a demand for Armor for Sleep, and they can do, this sounds shitty to say, I hope they can do a proper follow-up that is more in the vein of What to Do When You're Dead, not as far as a sound or anything, but like Ben said, there were no people looking over what they were doing to nitpick it, and I hope that they're able to create something with that kind of freedom, because I think, and it obviously shows from the one time that they've been able to do it, when they've been given the freedom to create as they want to, they're capable of just amazing things. And we've seen what happens when that's not the case, which is smile for you. And I'm not saying it's a bad record, but it's marred with too many hands in the jar. So I'm hoping if they do decide to come back, I hope they're able to kind of do things on their own with no label input, no management input, just be who they want to be and put out the record they want to put out, because I think that's going to be what generates the best results. So as a fan of Armor for Sleep in 2020, that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, definitely. And, like I said in the interview, it's not like they have to have a major label behind it. They sold out of records so quickly. There's a built-in audience. They'll be fine.
I agree. All of that said, like we already said in the intro, and as you've already heard, this is a long enough interview. This is a long enough episode. So kind of get right to it. End this episode on a high note. So if you would like to keep up with Armor for Sleep, find them on Facebook at Armor for Sleep, Instagram at Armor for Sleep, and Twitter at Armor for Sleep and Jay. If you would like to keep up with Ben, you can find him at Ben Jorg on Instagram and Twitter. Go to armorforsleep.com. Buy tickets, buy your vinyl, all that kind of stuff. Very much, like I said, hoping that the tour dates stay the way they are. Hopefully we'll go to Chicago and check out this show. I would love to see this record performed in its entirety. There's a lot of cool things as a guitar player learning this record over the last year or so that I've really come to appreciate and would love to see live and just kind of see how they pull it off. If you would like to keep up with our show sponsors, rockabilly.com, head over there, support them for supporting us. Like I said, if you're a new first-time user, you get 10% off your total purchase by putting in your email address and all that kind of stuff. They do have Armor for Sleep merch. They have Refuse merch. Pretty much any band that's been on this show, they have it. They have over 500,000 items for sale, spanning bands, spanning movies, spanning pop culture. If you are into it, it's probably over there. Go over to rockabilly.com and check everything out. Podcorn, thanks again for supporting this podcast. We are doing a bunch of shit. We're having a website built. We're having graphics being built, which you probably have already seen at this point. We're doing a lot of things. Bean Bastard, go to thebeanbastard.com, get you some delicious coffee, Facebook, Instagram at The Bean Bastard, On Point Pomade, use the code BSP15, get you some beard and hair care products, keep your hair and beard looking on point, support all of our sponsors for supporting us. We can't do this show without them. A lot of the things we're trying to do moving forward require these kinds of things, so support them for supporting us, and Dan will tell you where he can be found and where you can support him.
Well, you can find little me over at discussmetal.com, talking trash about your favorite band, or maybe saying they're the best band ever. It just depends, I guess, on what your favorite band is. You can find me on Twitter at discussmetaldan. You can send me an email at danandjoeshow@gmail.com. And you can even reach out to me on Facebook under Daniel Terry. I'm not hard to find. I'll probably accept your friend request unless you're like some kind of weirdo. But that remains to be seen. So go ahead and try it anyway.
And if you would like to keep up with this podcast, you can find us simply enough at BrewSpeak Pod, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Check us out on YouTube. We have videos where they're applicable. If you would like to support us monetarily, you can head over to patreon.com/BrewSpeakPod. If you would like to support us non-monetarily, leave us a rating, a review, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever podcatcher app you are using. It is greatly appreciated. And for the BREWtally Speaking Podcast, I am John.
And I am Dan.
And we will talk to you all next time.